Hey everybody, it's Professor Snart checking in as we move into our second unit in our Honors English 1130 Intro to Lit class. Sorry, I'm just using a new screen capture tool here, so I'm getting used to some of the buttons and stuff. So I'm recording this on Friday or Thursday morning, I should say. So that's our first due date for unit number 1. So just to revisit our due date system. So everything, all the main work in Unit 1 is due by the end of today or the end of Thursday, January 25th, and then any reply components would be due by that Sunday. So what you'll find actually is that generally speaking, as we get like from Unit 1 to Unit 2, you'll be done this part, but maybe still working on this part as you start the first section or some of the earlier work for Unit 2. So there's kind of an overlap potentially, from this into here, which is okay. And then, of course, there's lots of folks I know who are actually already done with all of this because we had enough people finish the main work for Unit number 1 early enough prior to this deadline that we could do the reply part, and then you've sort of wrapped it up before moving on to Unit 2. Again, the workload in Unit number 1 was fairly light. And not like super intensive. And that's kind of by design. Like, first of all, we want to get to know each other. So we do a bit of an icebreaker introduction kind of thing. But it's also important to just get a feel for the course. So you're not overwhelmed with a bunch of content work or reading or stuff like that as you figure out like the due dates and, what buttons to click to do what, and even how our assignments are kind of set up. Where you're bouncing between, like, in this case, Google Sites, building your portfolio page and doing that About Me page, but then also using the tool, the discussion board tool in Blackboard here, so that we can all post our URL to our site, and then also using the discussion board to reply to the portfolios that we look at for our classmates. So it's kind of like two different digital tools that we're using at the same time. And that's how most of our class, or much of our class, is set up. Even if we're using a tool like Google Slides or Sites or whatever it happens to be, it's often embedded within like a discussion board setup in Blackboard. So again, just something to get used to. It can feel a little awkward at first maybe, but once you've done it once or twice even, it becomes a little more second nature. And that's, of course, when we transition into more of the content stuff for our course. So again, our first unit, really just an introduction opportunity, building your portfolio site that we'll use throughout the term here, and then just building an About Me page. So if I look at our discussion board, pardon me, lots of people have posted their link, and then again, you can see sort of but just by number of posts, a few folks have done all the replies already, or even more than the required replies. So just to go back to the assignment, in addition to the remind thing, which is a good text alert, some introductory stuff, all of the text here is walking you through how to build that page, how to do the About Me part of it, and then of course publish your site to make it an actual thing. Then you're posting that URL. That's the thing that's due by the Thursday to complete your portfolio setup, the About Me page, and then post that URL. And then the reply, which we're using the discussion board here for, would be due by that Sunday. But of course, like I'm suggesting, as you finish maybe this stuff, you can certainly get into Unit 2. So it's not like you really have to wait to finish one thing discreetly and then move on to the next thing. Obviously, you don't want to get so far ahead that you forget to go back and do certain things, but you might find that there's a little bit of overlap. So now is a good time to look at Unit 2. Definitely getting more into the content of our course here. So we have our first reading assignments, a couple of short stories, one Flight Patterns by the Native American author Sherman Alexie, and then this really creepy one, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? By Joyce Carol Oates, a fantastic American author. Both still living, both still producing work. A couple of reading comprehension quizzes, and I'm, kind of ambivalent about these, honestly. They're very low point value. You can obviously have the text open in front of you. It's not some like, how much of the story have you memorized kind of a deal. And I find these valuable really not to test your knowledge of a story, but really to point things out or ask certain kinds of questions that might show you something or tell you something about the stories, or invite interpretations that you hadn't necessarily picked up on right away. So there are points attached to them, but it's important that we understand that these kind of quizzes, they're not the end all or be all, or this is just like, they're really our gateway into these stories, not the final test to see do you get it or not, quote unquote. Okay, there's a bit of a handout here that you can look at. So in this unit, we get into our first kind of section of the course, which is looking at short stories or short fiction, particularly those elements of the short story, which is really what this is all about. Most of the terms here, I'm guessing, are fairly familiar to you, even if you don't have like a complex working definition of them all. You've probably heard of these before. So we have broken up the elements here into character, setting, conflict, plot, which is primarily what we're working with in this unit, and then theme. Again, kind of this really generic term for like the idea, not necessarily the moral of a story, since we generally don't want to have a story with a bunch of morals or telling us lessons about life. But again, you know, the symbolic content, the allegory, the metaphor, et cetera, et cetera. Everything else is relatively surface level, or stuff that we don't necessarily need to dig that deeply to discover. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means that unlike theme, it's usually right there for us to see. So we can differentiate between major characters and minor characters. And again, you could even have differentiation on what I think is a major character and what somebody else thinks is a major character. So these aren't black and white kinds of categories. So the major character is the one generally, or ones generally, who are primarily actors or doers in a story. Minor characters tend to be reactors, or they're slightly more passive, maybe. Protagonist, antagonist. So the antagonist is just by default the one who sort of opposes the protagonist. And the thing that I want to draw people's attention to here is that the protagonist, again, kind of that main major character, is not necessarily the good guy. So we know in lots of cases, popular movies even, where the protagonist, the character that the whole narrative revolves around, isn't necessarily completely good or completely bad. Usually the most interesting ones are a mix of those. And the antagonist, again, sort of takes us into conflict here. It could literally be one person versus another, Batman versus Superman, if you ever suffered through that movie. But the question that really I'm inviting you to think about is, where do the sympathies of the reader lie, or where do you sense that we're supposed to have our sympathies? Are they with the protagonist? Are they with maybe an antagonist, kind of that good guy who's trying to get the bad guy to change, even though the main narrative revolves around that protagonist? And you might find in many stories that these sort of shift. So like in Flight Patterns, when you read that story, think really about like, who are we meant to align ourselves with or sympathize with? And is that necessarily what you would call the protagonist in the story? Okay, narration, first person, so the I voice, the very rarely used second person. This is sort of like the choose your own adventure voice, so you do this, you do that. And then the fairly common third person, and even the third person has a couple of different subcategories. The omniscient narrator, the one that knows everything about everyone, so we have this sort of big view of all the things that happen in a story. Or what we get, the limited omniscient, so we have insight into one or a couple of characters, but our narrator, although it's not a first person, like an I voice telling the story, doesn't necessarily know everything about every character. So we're still often trying to piece together certain parts of the story, or reasons that things happen, or relationships between characters, because we're not told that by our limited omniscient. And we could probably throw into this the unreliable narrator, where, yes, the narrator's telling us things, but are we actually supposed to 100% believe that person? One of my favorite unreliable narrators is Nick Carraway from Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. All right, so setting, again, where a story takes place. But what's really important when we think about setting is how setting, and in just about every short story, it's not if, it's how the setting is contributing to the theme of the story, right? So it's not just any old place where characters are doing things, but elements of setting, whether it's a literal place or just a kind of atmosphere or mood, it actually contributes to the story. All right, I'm going to cut myself here and then do part 2 in just a second.